How do you feel being my inaugural guest on Echtus interviews?
I am so honored to be your inaugural guest.
We should tell the good people how we know each other, and you can introduce yourself in the process.
Yeah, was it 7 years ago?
Oh gosh, yeah, yeah.
I think 7 years ago.
But
Where
neither of us have aged since, so
yes, that you can tell that from the color of my hair
well, same.
for sure. I think I was tasked back then as the head of training and education for Amazon Ads to really stand up the advertiser education side aside from the sales education. And I had never done it myself. I always dealt with sales education, but I had never really stood up a function when it came to externally facing training functions. And that's where my search started. And that's how we got introduced because, luckily enough, I convinced you to join me in that challenge, which thankfully you took it upon yourself.
All right, so I want to really kind of poke your brain a bit and learn about the evolution of the program and the evolution of your experience while you were there at Amazon. It grew so much. I was there from 2017 to 2020. I know we grew it a lot together, and then totally took off since I left. I'd love to just hear kind of your overview of how that evolution went through and from the beginnings to the more recent time. How did you see the program changing? How did you see it impacting the Amazon advertising business?
Yeah, I will try to be as concise as possible because it's a very long story. As you know yourself, we went through quite a lot of stages. I think the first thing that I would mention is that at the time when I joined, and even when you joined, it wasn't just that the training function was new to the business of Amazon. They always had sort of training specialists, but it was more about facilitating content that came from product or product marketing. But I think the first challenge, or let's say opportunity, that I had when I joined and when you joined is that Amazon was new to the entire what is education type of universe and what can education do for us. And I think, as with many organizations that I have worked with in my 20-25 year career in the ad tech space, is that training always has the first thing that comes to mind to every senior leader is that training is a support, a service function to the entire business, to the revenue generating business. And of course, that's a great thing because, in essence, if you think what training is, we are supporting a lot of different functions. But I think the main challenge, and therefore the threshold that we passed with having you as well in the team, is that we transition from having training and education as an ancillary support function to really become an education function that it's an integral part to the flywheel of the business and how it operates, and therefore um, revenue generating.
Yeah, so you were in the room quite a bit with the leadership across advertising. And what do you think some of those common misconceptions were that you heard around the purpose of training, the sort of difference of training and the
Yeah,
other content types?
I think the first misconception about training is that the training team and therefore what functions they should sit under is content development. And everything else outside of content development sits outside and it's not training. Which, with that, I mean, what is curriculum?
Mhm.
What's the importance of curriculum? What's the importance of building competences? Um, what's the importance of how do you communicate and what channels do you use to communicate your content? That was the first misconception. And the second, and potentially the most painful one, was the fact that there's that misconception that training is super relevant when we want somebody to adopt something, a product, which becomes very transactional. And I think the educational piece that we had to do to stakeholders is how does education can have a broader scope
Mhm.
outside of transactional actions
Mhm.
per se versus how what other types of content, what other types of content and modalities and delivery and channels play into what business goal do you want to achieve outside of just adopting a product or making a sale.
Right, right. Yeah, because there was a lot of just the previous work, as you had said, that was really focused on that and focused on that kind of one-to-one action. Like, let's put content out, and we're going to measure that that content worked to do this thing. There was not a understanding of building proficiency and like that sort of longer-term view. And from my perspective, over the years, over the last 7 years, you certainly had accomplished a lot by helping your executive team and stakeholders understand that scope because clearly the team grew so much and your scope grew. What is the trick that you think that you would like tell others that are listening to this because it's a common sort of
Yeah,
challenge that they have?
and that's a very interesting question. I think where the turning point was, and if I had to give one advice to any leader of any L&D training or education team, I would give is um, you need to start with what is the business objective behind deploying or creating any types of training programs. And with that, I mean, how do you measure success of the training? Because I think that is the first pitfall that a lot of us that we are in the L&D space can fall into, where we know we focus too much of the on the educating someone, whether it's a customer, whether it's a salesperson, with the intention of like making them competent to do their job.
Yeah.
But we fail much on the measurement on the business bottom line. And I think that's what leadership wants to see and realize, to pass and transition from the stage of being a transactional type of function or a support function to a function that really contributes to the flywheel of the business, which is basically revenue generating. And that's the turning point. And I think that's the pitfall that every training or educational program has to start with: what's the business objective and how does that connect with specific KPIs. We do not even start the process of developing a training program, and that means content, choosing the channel, without knowing in advance what is the KPI that that program is built to influence or impact. So at this stage that we're at, we are able to really measure the impact, the downstream impact to the business with specific KPIs,
Mm.
and that are measured and audited on a regular basis. And why that is important is because we are able to understand through these metrics what are the optimizations that we need to make, whether that's on content or the channel that we are delivering or the modality that we are delivering a training. So I think we are at that stage that we are able to really depict what's the downstream impact to the business with every single training program that we deploy currently.
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of along the lines of success measures. I know that Amazon, like many companies, has reorganizations. The larger the company, the more there's different structural changes. And even smaller companies, I've talked to quite a few people who they keep getting moved around from department to department. So I know that that happened at least twice that I can think of during my time there. How did that impact how you managed the team and sort of how you managed the overall success? Did you find that it sort of swayed things, or did you figure out a way to kind of navigate those changes?
Well, I think, and especially in the industry that we are at in our tech, things are changing constantly. Everything is moving with the speed of lightning. New products are emerging. New ways of buying media are emerging. So I think one thing that we did really well is the way we structured the team. It really we didn't have to really reorganize within ourselves because we were structured from the get-go the right way. And for the audience to understand what does it mean the right way is, again, always starts with what are the business objectives. The business objectives will never change of what is the purpose of all the educational programs that we're launching. What is changing is the environment that you operate at,
Mhm.
and you will be able to be agile enough. Any training and education function would be able to be agile enough if they're structured from the get-go in a way that it will allow you to be agile. And what I mean by that is, like, there are specific functions within a training team that need to be stood up in order for us to be able to operate in a very agile way.
Mhm. Yeah, I speak a bit about like the programmatic approach essentially. So you have your program managers, whether they're called that or not, but you have sort of program owners, program leaders that are doing, an enablement program or a product adoption program or certification program. Was that basically what you're referring to, like kind of these different initiatives? Or
Yes, and this is another challenge for any L&D org, as I said, because from the get-go, everybody suspects that the only function of a training org is developing content. And that was pretty early that I realized that that's not what's only needed to be a successful L&D team. There is content development, obviously, but nothing starts with content. You don't develop content before you know how do I get close to the business and how do I understand, how do I have a seat at the table. And what I mean a seat at the table in the senior leadership table to understand the business goals, to even identify what gaps exist and therefore how education can play a role. And that function is what we call potentially program management or curriculum. Curriculum should have a seat at the table,
yeah.
in the senior leadership table, to understand what are the pain points of the business, where is the business going, where is the business pivoting, and therefore what types of content and what types of audiences do we need to reach to be successful. If you
Okay.
start with content, potentially you will not achieve what you want to. So that's why I mentioned the different functions and standing up a team in a way that you're agile enough that even if the environment is changing or there are internal reorgs, your
Mhm.
team is always set up in a way that is able to adjust and answer those challenges and pivots.
Yeah, awesome. So it's like that cohesive strategy. You're kind of embedded in the business strategy and it doesn't really matter exactly like the organizational structure. Um,
Correct.
okay, so your team and scope was global, as you said, and definitely global, not sort of half global, but it felt really global. It was, I think you were in China at one time. I was talking to you, and Singapore. I don't know where you were, all over the place. I know there was one trip we were supposed to take to Japan together, and I
Right. You
bailed.
fail.
I bailed. There was a, if I remember, there was a monsoon or something. There was a reason I bailed, and you just flew right into the monsoon. Um, Anyway, so the having a global program like that, and not just with the team itself, but with different content and different subject matter experts and stakeholders all over the place. How do you kind of manage that? What are some of the tips? What are the challenges that are involved
Yeah.
with that?
I think that the main challenge, which I faced at the beginning of my career, because still my role was global from the get go, but really my team wasn't global because we were mostly based in the US. There is this assumption that you can have a global training team sitting in one location but serving different types of geographies and locales, because the only thing that you need is to translate the content.
Hmm.
And I think you would know more than anyone else that that is a big mistake. And I think the way we approached it is that, aside of the fact that yes, the content can be translated, but the most important part is not even the language; it's truly localizing and customizing the content to fit the market. And
Hmm.
what do you need to do that? Like in any other, let's say, product function, you need the right positioning. So
Hmm.
the training content has to have the right messaging, the right positioning that fits the market. Therefore, you need somebody to understand the messaging and positioning which by definition it makes it a sort of go-to-market role that can sit under education. And it's not just content development and content translation that it's going to be enough for that locale or geography. So I think that's the way we structured, and I think we have been very successful, is that we have functions within education that are solely responsible of how to position and how to bring to specific market any training program that lives, whether it's US based or EU based. How do you scale that globally? You need to have that differentiation of positioning and marketing into the different locales.
Yeah, that marketing piece is so important, and it really, like, even without talking about the globalization and localization topic, it's just having the personas and having clarity on who you're talking to so that you can market that is something that a lot of education teams kind of
Correct.
don't prioritize.
And
Um,
different geographies as well, you have to think that they utilize different channels to consume education. For example, one of the main challenges that I firstly faced is that all our training content was mostly based within our learning console, which is all our e-learnings, which is our external facing LMS. But when you go to markets, especially APAC, um, people consume content in different ways, and you would be surprised than in the Western world. They're much more advanced in the sense of like they're utilizing social media to learn quite a lot. They have their own social media channels, so you can assume that the content that you're creating in the US, that it can be an e-learning that goes into an LMS, will fit, let's say, WeChat, that it's the prominent channel in
right.
China where people learn. And therefore, you have to have a different strategy, which comes
Mhm,
back to my statement before that there are different functions that can sit within education to understand how this content lands, what
mhm.
modalities work in different geographies, what channels that content should be piped, which can be a challenge.
Yeah. And I think that I'm thinking about just how you must have seen education evolve, customer education. We've had conversations in the past about that delivery channel that you're talking about, and that it's not always in one system. How have you seen it over the maybe over the last year, last couple years? Like, what is the evolution that you're seeing, and what are some of the signals you're seeing that indicate different trends in
Yeah, I think that the signals that I had seen, especially even in the US, there's always this debate of should we have one central hub where everything lives in, whether it's one LMS, and let's base all our content and all our content strategy around that one LMS. And I think more and more, I think especially in the past 2 3 years, I saw the signals of less people visiting or adopting our solutions that were all based in the elements, or even better, I should say that I saw more and more people looking for education in other types of channels.
Mhm,
So it wasn't as much that we saw less adoption or less engagement in our LMS. I just saw adoption on other channels growing so much faster,
mhm,
which was a signal to me that I need to move faster of how do I reach our audience where they are at versus me trying to pull them in one central location.
yeah.
And I think that was the diversification of content channels that I had to see pretty early to be successful.
And how did the team sort of address that demand of reaching other channels?
Yeah, well, first of all, our content strategy had to change. I think until at the beginning, the first 3 years in the role, I think, and when you were there, we were heavily based on learning paths or in an e-learning modality or videos or webinars. Now our strategy has changed dramatically, where we will surface different types, length of content in different channels. We have YouTube channels, and of course, there's different types of content that you can have on YouTube. Where do you place tutorials versus webinars? Where do you place certifications? Or where do you place more transactional type of content where you want somebody to take an action?
Mhm,
those can go into more social media types
Mhm.
of channels because it's just quick, bite-sized. As much as I hate that word of bite-sized
Yeah.
education, it's more of a um, action adoption types of videos, which are very short. So we had to really pivot very quickly to that multi-channel kind of content strategy.
Yeah, and if I were to guess, because that was a bit after my time, but if I were to guess, that is probably aligned with the different program strategies that you have, right? So if you have a certain audience and certain reason that you're targeting, that audience, and that would be consistent there.
And especially you have to have a content strategy for all the different types of audiences because you can imagine, especially in the ad tech world, if we're talking about you're trying the business purpose of the program is to build long-term competency. You will never achieve that with any short video or via social channels. You need a very robust certification program, and therefore the decision tree goes, what channel do you use for that? That's the LMS because it has the capability of building different types of learning paths and be engaging for the client. When you're talking about um, demoing a product and or showcasing how a product works, of course, then you're not going to pick e-learning or an LMS, but you will pick more of a webinar type of modality where it can be either a live video recorded or workshop sessions. And again, the decision of what channel drives that.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of my other pet peeves. I only have a few, but it's one of my other pet peeves to see people jump to the decision of that modality and the decision of before they know why they're doing it and who they're actually doing it for. So it's uh,
Yes.
it's great to hear the sort of confirmation that there are these variety of ways of delivering content for different reasons for different audiences. What advice would you give sort of the new crop of customer education leaders that are coming up? It's definitely a challenging time, and just kind of going back to proving the value of customer education. What comes to mind if you were to give some solid advice to them?
Yeah. Um, it's a twofold answer. If you're looking from a customer perspective, the first thing that you should do right and you should never compromise is starting from the customer, which is it shouldn't be news to you being an Amazonian for so long that we always start with the customer and understanding what is the purpose of the training program you're building. And what I mean, what is the purpose? It's beyond improving competency. If you know that the purpose is because you want somebody to utilize a product in an effective way,
Hmm.
is it a long term? Are you trying to influence loyalty or are you trying to be more transactional? So, understanding and diving deep of what's the end goal of any training program, I think it's the most important step that will help you and guide you in your decisions thereafter of what do you need to build, where do you need to place it, what content, and what modality. That's when we're talking about the customer. If we're talking about what does a leader needs to think in order to be successful internally in an organization, I think it's to what we discussed at the beginning of our conversation, which is proving the value that a training function can have to the bottom line of the business, making that connection as close as possible and airtight.
Hmm.
It's something that would earn the trust from the business and really believe in the mission and the vision that any L&D should have in order to gain alignment quickly, resources, whether that's budgetary resources or headcount resources. Try to connect the value that you bring as an education team to the business revenue generating flywheel. And of course, that's the biggest challenge that any L&D would have. But if you get that right, I think your life would be much easier thereafter.
Well, it's great advice. The whole thing was great advice, and always great to chat with you. And I really appreciate you being my inaugural guest. You've set the bar high for anyone that I ask in the future.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, I missed in this conversation you pushing back on me and debating that endlessly, which is something that I always valued from you. So, but I appreciate that this was mostly helpful to your audience.
it was definitely helpful. I had 3 or 4 things I could have pushed back on, but we'll do that in a different call. No,
Of
no, it's
course.
great. It's great. For anyone listening, I always quote, Panos as being, one who taught me probably more than anyone else in my career because, our experience
Well, I'm
working
lucky
together
enough
is
because I think you taught me more than I did. And that's always a blessing for a manager.
you're welcome.